Okay, good morning, everyone. So today is going to be our last class together, and there's a whopping 6 of you here. I don't know why I expect any different, but so today we're going to be covering my favorite topic of the semester, and the one that I am most qualified to talk about. Not that I'm not qualified to talk about all the other ones, but this one in particular I'm the most qualified to talk about, and this is the human microbiome. And as you probably have heard in the news at some point, human microbiome is making all sorts of waves, and lots of interesting things are coming out about the human microbiome, whether it's in relation to public health crises like obesity, Alzheimer's, dementia, any number of interesting things you could think of. There's been some study done about how the microbiome is involved. And as you'll sort of see, the microbiome is really a part of you that simply cannot be ignored, simply because you are outnumbered by microbes on your body. So it's a really important thing, and so it deserves its own topic. And I'm also very excited to talk about it. And I think it's also a great way to end our time together, because as I mentioned, this is our last class. So if you like what we're talking about today, if this microbiome stuff interests you and all, I always like to recommend these 2 books. First one is Dirt is Good by my colleagues, I should say, Jack Gilbert and Rob Knight. Really, really fantastic book about how dirt and your immune system as a child is trained by microorganisms. So that's the first one. And the second one is sort of a much more broad book called I Contain Multitudes by a very fantastic writer for The Atlantic named Ed Yong. He's probably one of the best science reporters out there, in my opinion. But these 2 books are really, really fascinating reads. Very different. This one, again, as I mentioned, this one's about babies and how babies develop and how important the microbes are. And then this one is more so like, hey, here's all the crazy and wacky stuff microbes do. Just wanted to do a little cool microbiome news. So this one came out last year, but it really sort of sets the stage for today's class, because it really puts this idea in your brain: what can't microbes do? So there's this new study that came out, this is from NPR, and it says, surprising new insights into the link between the gut microbiome and aging. And just when you thought, aging was already difficult enough, apparently your microbes play a role in this as well. So a new study that was published in the journal Science Translational Medicine, they linked on the linkage between aging and the gut microbiome. Now, what they did is they looked at mice to understand how the function of the microbiome affects aging. So what they did is they took young mice and old mice in the laboratory setting, harvested their gut microbiome, so they just took their poop, and then they fed it to sterile or germ-free mice. And the sort of interesting the way this was set up is they gave young mice, the microbiome of young mice, to both young mice and old mice that had no microbiome, and vice versa. They gave the microbiome of old mice to sterile young and old mice. So the idea you're seeing is, given you have a blank slate, no microbiome, what happens when you introduce a microbiome from a young mouse to an old mouse, a young mouse to a young mouse, and an old mouse to an old mouse, and an old mouse to a young mouse? That's the sort of the setup they're looking at. It was sort of interesting thing is they found out that the microbes didn't cause the mice to gain weight any differently, which we've seen a bunch sort of in the sort of literature of microbiome, and as we'll talk about later on. But the mice that received the old microbiome displayed an altered mental capacity. They were becoming more and more like those that are older mouse, displaying signs of dementia, cognitive decline, things like that. And before you ask yourself this question, yes, mice can get dementia. They can display symptoms of dementia, which is why they're a really good model to understand dementia in humans as well. But the idea being is, if you got the microbiome from an old mouse, you would start to age faster. You would get older just by the presence of that microbiome. And it's sort of a kind of a weird thing, right? Your microbiome can cause you to age. But as you'll see, the microbiome is so heavily linked to the function of your body. It's crazy, but it's honestly not that surprising. So the bottom line here, there's some interesting other science they did, but the bottom line for this study is the microbiome can influence aging, not again, aging, which is wild, right? Just your microbes living in your gut can influence your aging. And if beauty products didn't have enough struggle already, this just adds to the struggle that all these cosmetic companies has to try to make people stay beautiful forever. So with that little science article out of the way, I just want to start off by hitting you with every microbiologist's favorite fun fact. I bring this up all the time. You can ask my wife. She's heard this fact a bajillion times. And this fact is that there are 10 times as many bacterial cells on and inside you than your own cells, which means that there are 10 times more microbes living on and in you than there are of your own cells. So on a sheer mass, number of cells, you are more microbe than you are human, which I think is a crazy thing to think about, right? You can't see your own cells, and you certainly can't see microbial cells, but there are more microbial cells that make you than there are human cells that make you. Another way to put this is that all the cells that are in your body, whether they're you or microbial, 90% are microbes, which is crazy. So you could ask the question, what are we really? Are we microbe or are we human? And I think the obvious answer here is we're human, not microbe, but it really does blur the line of how much of an important role they play in your everyday physiology, everyday anatomy, and your everyday behaviors. And you see this fact everywhere, including the most famous microbiology textbook, which is called Brock's Microbiology of Organisms. So it's a really big fact, really fun fact. But the question we can ask is it real? And so this has some historical precedent, started in 1972, and it's been revised a few times. If you want to read these, go for it. But I figured I'd let you know there is some historical precedence from it. It's not just a fact in a textbook. So let's walk through how we get this number, because I think it's a really big number. So first we want to answer the question is how many bacteria on you? Now, we can look at a couple different parts of your body. We have the colon, the small intestine, dental plaque, saliva, skin, stomach. And you notice that we have the typical concentration of bacteria here. And then we have the volume, and we can use that volume times the total number of bacteria to get the total number of bacteria in that given organ, right? So what you'll see is like in your stomach, you have 10 to the 7 bacteria, whereas in your large intestine, you have 10 to the 14 bacteria. And there's some range of microbes present on your body. But you'll notice that the places that are the highest include your dental plaque and your colon, and much higher than your skin and other places. So if brushing your teeth wasn't important already, you got 10 to the 12, or about 100 billion microbes in your dental plaque. So make sure you brush those teeth nice and well. But the important thing here is the vast majority of the microbes are actually just in your large intestine, in your colon. And so when we think about where microbes are, about 90% of the microbes, about 95% of the microbes are in your colon. So when we think about microbes inside you, we really just need to focus on the colon, because that's where it's really at. So colon, high density, high volume. That's in contrast to other places like your skin, which has very high sort of surface area, but very low density of microbes. So we can calculate how many microbes we have in our colon. And that, again, that comes out to about 38 trillion bacteria, or 3.8 times 10 to the 13 bacteria. It's a really, really big number, right? We can look at how many, you can use a microscope to count how dense the bacteria are. You can use x-rays, autopsies, and MRIs to calculate your colon volume. And then you math it and you get 38 trillion. So there's about 38 trillion bacteria in your colon, which again is about 90% of all bacteria on and inside you. So the colon is a good proxy to understand total bacterial density. How many human cells do we have is the next question, because we want to see how much human cells you have versus how much microbes you have. We want to know how much human cells you have. And we can use very similar density times volume calculations to do this. And if you look at this sort of nice little graph over here on the side, a breakdown of how many different types of cells you have, immune cells, fat cells, bone marrow, platelets, neurons, muscle cells, right? This is the breakdown. What you'll notice is that your erythrocytes, or essentially your red blood cells, they make up about 84% of all your cells, which I always think is weird. I always would imagine like skin cells would have been the most, but you have more red blood cells than anything. And intuitively that makes some level of sense, right? We need to be able to carry oxygen over your body. We need lots of red blood cells to do that. So there is sort of an idea that we can look here is just look at your red blood cells. Or we can do the math here. We can add up all of these, and we get about 3.0 times 10 to the 13 human cells, or about 30 trillion. So we look at this and we say, okay, we got about 3.8 times 10 to the 13 bacteria, 3.8 times 3 times 10 to the 13 human cells, which puts us at about a 1-to-1 ratio. So we sit down and do the math. not really as a group since, we're not together, but, I do the math for you. We see we had about a 1-to-1 ratio. So that 10 times as many bacteria on you as there is your cells doesn't really quite hold true here, but it's still a striking 1-to-1 ratio. I know these numbers are very, very, there's a big difference, right? 3.8 trillion versus, 38 trillion versus 30 trillion might seem like a big difference, but when you're talking about such astronomical numbers as this, that small number difference is not a big deal. So it's about a 1-to-1 ratio here, which again, I still think is astounding, right? And so we can do the same math and we can look at a bunch of different people. So man, woman, infants, the elderly, the obese. And what we can look at is here's the total bacteria here. It's pretty consistent across them. But you'll notice that infants have less bacteria than adults. So this holds pretty consistent. This idea of a 1-to-1 ratio holds pretty consistent across most populations, most age groups, most demographics. It doesn't really matter what sort of divide you look at unless it's very old versus very young. There's a pretty consistent 1-to-1 ratio here. So I think that's pretty cool. I think it's pretty informative. So all of us in this class have about the same amount of microbes, that 1-to-1 ratio as a whole. So we are still outnumbered by bacteria, but it's closer to a 1-to-1 ratio as a whole. We can still use that 10-to-1 ratio, but we just have to say we're only using nucleated cells, so basically ignoring red blood cells. We can go that route if we'd like. And it's estimated that you have about a 0.2 kilogram size ball of bacteria on you, which is about the mass of a softball. So if you took all the microbes, smushed them into one little package, they'd be about the size and the weight of a softball. And you can look at what are called, not what are called, but you can look at defecation events, and this will actually shift the balance to be more human than bacterial cells. So every time you go to the bathroom, you become slightly more human than you are microbial. And when I first read about this sort of idea at the bottom, my friend and I were talking about it. He's like, "Oh, this is how you take back your humanity." And so you can thank my friend, that's a professor at BU, for this little line down here. But when you poop, you shift the balance between being more human than bacteria. So you're no longer in a 1-to-1 ratio. You have more human cells than bacteria cells every time you poop. So that's a fun fact. I'm pretty sure you didn't want to know that, but if you want to be a cool guy or cool girl and drop that fact in a party conversation, I'm sure you'll get some so fun looks. I know I do when I drop weird facts like that as well. So those are our 30 trillion bacteria, 1-to-1 ratio to our cells. This is what we call our microbiota. This is the microbes that are living on and inside you. They are comprised primarily of bacteria. 98% of all microbes that live on and inside you are bacteria. But there are naturally occurring viruses, fungi, microkaryotes, archaea, and yeasts, and even sort of within this microeukaryotes, you have essentially like microscopic arthropods. And what I mean by this is, and if you want to gross yourself out, you can look up eyelash mites. You have a natural community of microscopic mites living on and inside you at all given times. And that's what we really think about when we have microeukaryotes here. And again, if you want to creep yourself up, Google eyelash mites, it'll creep you out. So that's our microbiome. Again, mostly bacteria, and that's typically what we think of here. Now, microbiome, history-wise, it started all the way back in the 1670s. It's from a gentleman named Anton von Leeuwenhoek, and he's the first guy that invented the microscope, and he's the first person to ever observe microscopic cells under a microscope. So he was the first person to say like, hey, wow, there's a microscopic world that makes up everything. So this was back in the 1670s. He termed his microscopic cells animalcules because he didn't quite know what they were. They weren't animals, they weren't plants, so he called them animalcules. And Leeuwenhoek, he did some really interesting stuff. He took some tooth scrapings, to look at the microbes under his little microscopes. And he did these experiments where he would take tooth scrapings, look at the microbes under the microscope, then drink scalding hot coffee. And I mean scalding hot coffee. I mean like he would burn his mouth, like boiling water, like a true scientist doing stupid stuff to show something. And then he would scrape his teeth again, look at the microbes under the microscope, and he would see that the microbes were dead. So he could see that the microbes were being heat killed by this. So he was the first person to really put forth this idea of sterilization, but he all did it just by looking at tooth scrapings of microbes. And remember, you got tons and tons of microbes living on your dental plaque. So that was 1670s. Fast forward to the 1970s, we were aware that we had a microflora and that they were very abundant inside and on our skin and, you know, in our colon and all these different places. And then fast forward to the 2000s, we sort of were like, we realized like, holy crap, like we need to really understand these microbes because they were, they're not just pathogens. And sort of as I mentioned when we talked about microbes, you know, naturally speaking, the human microbiome is comprised of essentially no pathogens. The microbes that live on inside you, they have an evolved history from you. We have co-evolved with them over millions of years. So they live with us and they don't live pretty much anywhere else. So what we have here is a really strong co-evolved relationship. And one of the reasons we realized that that the microbiome was really important is because we were looking that inside the humans, what we were producing for proteins, and we realized that we simply could not explain all the protein products that we were seeing inside of our bodies or in our skin just by our own human genome. And so we needed to sort of point to a reason why these products were present in our body. And the only reason we could come up with, and the reason we know that they exist now, is the microflora, that microbiome. So it became really important to understand the microbes when we realized that how humans function, really vital products were being produced by our microbes. And so as you saw from the opening slides of this, microbes can do some crazy things. It wasn't until the 2000s that we really said like, hey, this is important. We need to understand this. And so this led to the development of what we call the Human Microbiome Project. If you pay attention to science news, you'll see this all the time. Human Microbiome Project is a really important project to characterize the healthy microbiome of humans using all sorts of molecular tools, principally like DNA sequencing and looking at proteins and stuff like that. And the whole point of this project, and they got about $150 million, and they've been refunded since since 2008. And they were trying to identify a core set of microbial taxa universally present in all human individuals. Now, the idea behind this is if you could identify what a normal microbiome looked like, you could potentially look at, well, what has changed in an unhealthy person's microbiome, and then try to fix that to bring them back to a healthy microbiome, thus potentially curing them of their disease. That's the idea here. And so their original sort of project, they sampled 300 individuals. They were aged 18 to 40 years old. They sampled each person 1 to 3 times, and they sampled them over 18 locations in their body, which led to a total of 11,000 samples, which led to thousands of genomes, tons and tons of terabytes of data. And they sampled a bunch of different places, including the nose, the skin, the GI tract, the vagina, all places associated with the vagina, and a bunch of spots in the oral cavity. And so this is what they sampled. Well, what did they find? Well, the important thing they did find, and what they were really looking for, is they did find what we call a core microbiome. Now, this core microbiome was consistent across most people, but varied depending on where you looked. And what I mean by this is if I looked at my stool, so I looked at my gut microbiome, and I compared that to, say, my elbow microbiome, well, they had a very different set of microbes. But when they looked from elbow to elbow or nose to nose, well, they found a core microbiome across those sort of body parts. Now, between different people, but the same part. So they did find that core microbiome, but what they did find was the microbiome was highly variable. And they were variable based upon some pretty key characteristics, including the lifestyle of the human, the genetics of the human, the physiology and the immune response of the human, the environment, and so where they were going. So they'd have, if you traveled a lot, you would pick up microbes from where you traveled. The pathology, how sick you were, as well as what you sort of did as a human. So all these things that you do in your everyday life act to shape your variable human microbiome. But again, you do have this core set that you do share across different human beings. And they sort of identified a group of bacteria. There's only about 10 or so groups of bacteria. You can see these over here on the right. And these pretty much make up all of the microbes you find on your humans. There's a pretty catenated set of humans microbes that can actually live on a human body. Because remember, as I mentioned, this is an evolutionary relationship. This has evolved over millions of years of hominid evolution. So what can live there is specific to you. And it's very hard for new microbes to sort of come. and sort of colonize. And I'll discuss that when we talk about your skin microbiome in a little bit, but just to know, you have a core microbiome. It's sort of a limited set of all the microbes out there. And it's an evolved evolutionary relationship. So as I mentioned, one of the things they found is location matters. And what I mean by this is different locations on your body have different communities. So your nose has a different community than your butt. Your elbow has a different community than the bottom of your foot. That's what I mean by location matters. Now, intuitively, this makes some degree of sense, right? Your skin is a very different environment than your colon. Your elbow is a very different environment than your armpit, right? These are different environments. And as we know from our talk about ecology, right? We know that the desert has different animals or different plants than the tropical rainforest. And that's true for the human microbiome. You have to think about the human and your different parts of your body as like different little ecosystems, because you are an ecosystem to a microscopic organism. And in fact, you are many ecosystems, right? Your armpit's like your armpit's like a rainforest, right? And your elbow is like a desert, right? You are comprised of many different microbial and microscopic ecosystems, which I think is a really fun way to think about the human body. You know, we have different parts and whatever, but I like to think of myself as a bunch of different ecosystems, and I'm just a big home to my microorganism. So I think that's kind of cool. Maybe you don't think that's cool, but I think that's cool. So there was a decent amount of overlap between the skin and different parts of your body. But again, most locations were unique, and there was more variability in your skin and your mouth, and there was very little variability in your GI tract. So we could look at this. And so just ignore the graph on the bottom. This is metabolisms. You don't need to worry about this. But the graph on the top, it's a stack, what we call a stacked bar plot. Each color corresponds to one of these bacterial groups over here. And each sort of like individual bar that you kind of can't see, but you kind of can see, they correspond to a single sample. So we have, like for instance, like this sample here, that's one sample. It adds up to 100%. So this is all relative abundance. So, but what you notice is that we have the nose, your mouth, your plaque, your tongue, your stool, and your formix. You can see all the colors vary, right? So in your nose, you have lots of actinobacteria, but when you start to look at your stool, you don't have any actinobacteria, right? So you can see that the types of microbes change. But again, it's all that same group of 10 microorganisms. But again, it varies depending on location. So given that microbiomes change on these locations, right, we have our ecosystems. Let's look at some of these specific biomes. What do they do for you? What microorganisms live there? And those sorts of things. So we're going to start off with the most extreme environment that you have. And this is your gastric microbiome. And when I say your gastric microbiome, I am directly just talking about your stomach, your gastric cavity. Now, this all basically starts and ends with one bacteria. And this bacteria is a bacteria named Helicobacter pylori. And Helicobacter pylori, it's a really cool bacteria. This is what it looks like under a microscope. This is it's colonizing your stomach cells. But the cool thing about Helicobacter pylori is it's what we call an acidophile. And what that means is it loves very acidic conditions. So Helicobacter pylori likes the very, very acidic conditions inside your stomach. And I'm sure you guys all know your stomach produces acid to help digest your food. And Helicobacter pylori, unlike most bacteria, can live inside all your stomach acid. And so you're as I mentioned, this is sort of the most extreme environment inside your body because of how acidic it is. As we talked about, pH is a tough thing for organisms to deal with. And Helicobacter pylori does really well inside your stomach. Now, the cool thing about Helicobacter is it's associated with ulcers, so perforations and bleeding inside your stomach. But when Helicobacter is present inside your stomach, it accounts for about 90% of all bacteria in your stomach. Greater than that, sometimes it's 100%. But there are some individuals that lack Helicobacter pylori, and Helicobacter is replaced by a couple different types of bacteria. That are listed here. You don't need to learn them or anything about them, but vast majority of people are dominated by Helicobacter pylori. Helicobacter pylori, as I mentioned, has a really interesting history. It is the causative agent of ulcers, and this was discovered by, what's his name? I can't remember the scientist's name. It was discovered by a scientist in the 1980s. He's what you could actually call a crazy scientist, because he had a hypothesis that Helicobacter pylori caused ulcers. So what he did is he grew Helicobacter pylori, he drank a bottle of Helicobacter pylori, and then he developed ulcers. And then he cured himself of the Helicobacter pylori infection, with antibiotics, getting rid of his ulcers, thus proving Helicobacter pylori caused ulcers. And so this is a really fun comic, and there's a really nice little, sort of little article here about him, as he was a sort of really important person for understanding how ulcers form, because they were kind of a big deal, at least previously. And I like this little comment because it makes him much cooler and not just like a dumb scientist drinking a potentially dangerous bacteria here. But Helicobacter pylori, again, does colonize your stomach, and it causes ulcers or perforations in your stomach. So important microbe for the average everyday function of your stomach. So that's our stomach. But let's move down the GI tract a bit, and we'll think about your gut microbiome. And so your gut microbiome, again, is your colon, your small intestine, right? And this is where the vast majority of microbes that make you live. Now, when you are born essentially sterile, but you are seeded by microorganisms by your mother and the surrounding environment. The initial microbes that colonize your gut are a group of bacteria called lactobacillus. Now, you've definitely heard of lactobacillus if you've ever seen a commercial for yogurt or kefir or something like that. This is the microbes that they put in yogurts to make them taste yogurty. But lactobacillus is a very common microbe that's in your early gut. So within the very first year of life, you have an estimated 10 to the 13 to 10 to the 14 microbes, which comprise about 500 to 1,000 species in your GI tract alone. If you're a child that's, excuse me, after you are weaned from milk or breast milk, the gut microbiome does eventually become very firmly established, leading to a lifelong microbiome. So by the time you're about 2 years old, you develop an adult microbiome, and that's pretty consistent with you throughout the rest of your life. It does vary if you change your diet and stuff like that, but it is pretty consistent. Sort of an interesting thing, your gut is dominated by two groups of bacteria called the firmicutes. People also call them the firmicutes because, scientists are weird, as well as the Bacteroidetes. And these microbes have such a strong evolutionary relationship with us, they physically cannot grow anywhere else. So you take these groups of microbes that live in our stomach, they won't grow anywhere else. They only grow inside humans. They won't grow anywhere. They won't grow in a petri dish. They won't grow in delicious broth. They won't grow in another host. They only grow inside us. So that's sort of an important thing. And the development of the microbiome really starts and is really affected by the environment of the baby. So if we have three mothers here, they're all going to give birth at the exact same time. How the mothers behave actually influences the development of your gut microbiome as an infant. So we have two ways children can be born, either vaginally or via C-section. Now, a sort of interesting thing is babies that are born via C-section versus sort of traditionally vaginally, they have a different microbiome. Because you can imagine, as I mentioned, the vagina has a resident microbiome. So as the infant is passing through the vagina, it picks up microbes from the vagina. That's in contrast to a C-section baby, which is essentially in the creepiest of all the medical procedures. I think a woman is still awake for it. You cut her belly open and you take the baby out, which I think is weird. And I'm definitely glad I don't ever have to do that. But that's what we're talking about here, right? Traditional versus C-section. But you can imagine, like, if you're a baby coming out of the vagina, you get seeded by all your mother's vaginal microbiome. Whereas if you're a C-section baby, you're pulled out and you are seeded by microbes that are from the environment. So from the doctor, from the skin, from the air, right? That's how you're being seeded. And so babies that are born via traditional vaginal birth have a very different microbiome than those that are born via C-section. Now, the other big issue, I shouldn't say issue, that's the wrong word of saying it, but the other thing we see is babies that are born traditionally, again, vaginally born, depending on what type of food they are fed, so breast milk versus baby formula, you get a different microbiome. And so babies that are breastfed have a much more diverse and much more species-rich microbiome than those that are fed from a bottle. Now, there is all sorts of things that are associated with this sort of the early development of an infant's microbiome. So babies that are born vaginally are typically are healthier than those that are born via C-section. They have less allergies, things like that. Babies that are breastfed typically have, versus bottle-fed, typically have less gastrointestinal problems, less allergies, and they're typically overall healthier children. So if there's a sort of lot of things that are interested with the early microbiome. We don't quite understand why at this given time, but just to know that there are potentially lifelong changes that you can induce in your child by choosing how they were born and breastfeeding versus not breastfeeding. If you want to know a little bit about this idea, I recommend taking a peek at that book I mentioned at the beginning, Dirt is Good. It really talks about this, really gets in depth about how these sort of effects can really impact the development of a child's microbiome. Now, the gut microbiome does develop independent of sort of how you were born and what you were fed as an infant. Your gut develops, your skin develops, everything develops depending on your environment. And so depending on where you live in the world, if you have siblings or pets, that sort of kind of makes up your environment. That will dictate how your microbiome develops. Your genetics also dictate what microbes can live on you, because what your genetics say influences your phenotypes, right? And your phenotypes, the physical manifestation of your genes, which can tell your body to behave in one way or another. Diet also influences this. So when we switch from solid, formula to solid food, depending on what type of food you eat, this influences your microbiome. And the final thing that's kind of interesting is if you take antibiotics or not. So almost every child is given antibiotics the second they are born, especially at least in Western countries. And most children receive several courses of antibiotics over the sort of first couple years of their life because children are susceptible to infections and children are gross. They do all sorts of gross stuff like eat stuff off the floor. But antibiotics, as you can imagine, also affect your microbiome. So all this thing in your environment acts to affect the development of your gut microbiome. But regardless of what this trajectory is of your microbiome, whether it's good or bad or natural or non-natural, it doesn't really matter. After about 2.5 years, you stabilize to your adult microbiome. So no matter what you do, you eventually stabilize and you have an adult microbiome after about 2.5 years. And that pretty much carries consistently throughout your entire life. Now, as we mentioned, the gut itself has the largest number of microbes and the greatest variety of microbes. So there are more species living inside your colon than there are anywhere else on your body. So your gut microbiome is really abundant and it's really species rich. Most of the taxa belong to, as I mentioned, the firmicutes and the Bacteroidetes. And the thing that you would imagine is that these are what we call obligate anaerobes. So they only live in the absence of oxygen. Because your colon is oxygen-free. Now, the interesting thing about your colon as a whole is it's oxygen-free, not because your body makes it that way, but because the microbes in your stomach, in your colon, make it that way. So they're engineering the environment to be oxygen-free. And the way they're doing this is just by respiring. So as they respire, they're consuming that oxygen, getting rid of all the oxygen. And once the oxygen is gone, they switch to a different type of metabolism. Now, as I mentioned, your environment affects you. So living in the city promotes a different microbiome than living in the country, and being a hunter-gatherer gives you a completely different microbiome as well. So your environment really matters for your gut, and diet is a huge push on the gut microbiome as a whole. And you can imagine this is the reason this is important is because if you eat something, right, it has to pass through your stomach and it passes through your large and small intestine. And so you can imagine that your diet really affects them because they are essentially feeding off what you feed them, right? And so because they're linked to the digestion of your body, they are super important for how well you can digest any given food and how much nutrition you can derive from any given piece of food you eat. And I think that's an important thing to make mention of. If you eat McDonald's every day versus compared to, say, a vegetarian, you two are going to have very different microbiomes. But if you fed you the exact same type of food, so if you took a McDonald's eater and a vegetarian, and then you fed them McDonald's, well, the person that eats McDonald's is going to be able to better digest that McDonald's because their microbiome is more attuned to McDonald's than that vegetarian, and vice versa. So a vegetarian can better digest plant fibers than someone who eats only McDonald's. So your microbiome is really in tune to your diet. And the important thing that microbes do is they extract nutrients from your food that you physically could not do. Your acid can only do so much. Your gut, the way you pull and extract water from food can only do so much inside your colon. We rely heavily on microbes to break apart our food and to get nutrients that we otherwise could never get, but are vital to what we need. Now, to give you an example of this, xyloglucans are really common fibers found inside vegetables such as onions and lettuce. We actually cannot physically get those out of onions and lettuce. They're very valuable for nutrition. So we actually rely on microbes to pull them out of these vegetables and give them to us so that we can be healthier. Microbes also liberate what we call short chain fatty acids from indigestible dietary fibers. And these are important energy sources for your intestinal lining. So it makes your intestines sort of healthier by the microbes liberating these short chain fatty acids from dietary fiber. So think of like plant materials, things like that. And this is sort of the idea why eating lots of fiber is good for the health of your gut, is because your microbes are pulling these fatty acids, which nourish your gut lining, which makes your gut healthier. So they are linked to the gut health. And finally, your intestinal bacteria actually give you all the vitamin B and vitamin K that you can handle. So if you got rid of all the microbes in your body, at least in your colon, you would not have enough vitamin B or vitamin K. And those are two vital vitamins. You actually couldn't clot your blood if you didn't have vitamin K. So if you got a small bleed and you had a vitamin K deficiency, you would die. But luckily, your microbes give you all the vitamin K you can handle, and they do it just by synthesizing it. They synthesize it and they pass it on to you. So they're nice guys here. Now, you can imagine there's also some crosstalk here, right? Your microbes give you stuff, you give your microbes stuff, right? You're giving your microbes food, and you're giving them other compounds via secretions in your colon, and they're giving you stuff right back. But as I mentioned, your microbes are very diverse inside your gut. There is about 150 times the amount of genetic material. So there's about 5 million genes inside your colon, and that's in contrast to about 23,000 genes inside the human genome. So your microbes have a lot of genetic diversity relative to you, and allows your microbes to break down many, many more potential energy sources. So just to give you a perspective about this, rodents that you raise in a sterile environment and lack a gut microbiome need to eat 30% more calories just to remain at the same weight as their normal microbiome-filled counterparts. So your microbes allow you to maintain and extract more energy from food, maintain body mass. And I'm sure there's going to be papers coming out in the near future that link, all sorts of diseases where people have difficulty putting on weight or losing weight to the microbiome as a whole. So again, really, really important role microbes play in your digestion, your nutrition, your health. This is a really important organ. You don't really think about your GI tract being important, but it really, really is, because you as a person really starts with that colon, getting all the nutrients you can out of it. You can eat the healthiest food in the world. You can eat superfoods or whatever you want to call them, but without a good microbiome, you can't do crap with that, to put it bluntly, and to make it relate right back to the idea that we're talking about the colon here. So that's your gut. I hope I convinced you that your gut is important. It's a pretty fascinating organ. It has all sorts of cool stuff that happens in it. But let's talk about your largest organ next, and this is your skin. And your skin is your largest organ. It's about 1.8 meters squared. So if you took all your skin off and you measured how much area it covers, it's about 2 meters. It's pretty big. Your skin is important. It acts as your first line of defense in your immune system. So it basically prevents microbes from getting inside your body. It just acts as a direct barrier. And it does this by just being a barrier, but it also acts as a barrier to pathogens because of your microbes. And so your microbes essentially prevent other bad microbes from colonizing your skin and potentially causing disease. So your skin, again, is your first line of defense, and that part of that line of defense is actually because of your microorganisms. There's about 10 to the 10 bacteria that live on your skin. So every square centimeter has about 1 million bacteria, which would be about 500,000 bacteria per square The initial taxa, as I mentioned, are very similar to vaginal ones, but C-section babies, their original taxa are very similar to the skin, as well as the air and those that are around them early on. But it really doesn't matter what sort of ways you were born. Within a few days, your skin microflora actually gets dominated by two groups of bacteria, Streptococcus and Staphylococcus, and those are pretty much the only microbes that you find in meaningful abundance on your skin. And by the time you're 2 years old, your microflora on your skin is fully developed and mature. It looks adulty. Now, you might recognize Streptococcus. If you ever had strep throat like I have, I've had strep throat about 30 times, and then they ripped my tonsils out, and now I don't get strep throat anymore. But strep throat is the mic. No, I just. Yes, no, here. Just someone say yes on the chat so I know. Okay, cool. Anyways, I wanted to just mention that Streptococcus causes strep throat. It's a normal skin bacteria. It's a good microbe on your skin. So don't be creeped out that you have lots of strep on your skin, and it causes strep throat. It's just a normal part of your body. Your skin environment as a whole is cool. It's pretty dynamic. So it's and it's also susceptible more so than any other part of your body to the environment around them. And overall, this makes the skin a pretty tough place to live. It can be very cold. So, if you live in a very cold environment, it can be very hot. If you live in hot environments, it's slightly acidic. It can be very dry. So, you can think of, this is called desiccated, but, lack of liquid water for these microbes. And it's bathed in sweat. And for those of you that know what sweat tastes like, it tastes very salty, right? So your skin is kind of a harsh environment. It's salty, it's dry, it's acidic, it's cool. There's not a lot of nutrients out there. So the microbes that live on your skin rely directly on what your body is secreting through the skin, which is particularly sebum and lipids. And it's sort of the other thing that's good about your skin, but also bad at the same time. It's replete with antibiotics. So lots of antimicrobial compounds exist on your skin that make it kind of a harsh place for some microbes to live as well. And overall, your skin is broken up into three parts. So you have sebaceous, which is oily, moist, and then dry. So sebaceous would be like anytime you have a crease. So like your back of your ears, your nose creases, the biggest crease is going to be your butt. But you can also think of creases as in like between your toes and stuff like that. So that's your sebaceous or oily glands. Moist is going to be, very, very wet areas. So you're thinking about, your groin, you're thinking about your armpits, things like that. And then finally, dry areas are pretty much everywhere else. So you can think about your back. You think about your back just being one big dry desert. Your elbows, I think, are the best way to sort of think about it because your elbows are always kind of dry. Overall, unless you lotion them up every day, of course. But even then, they're still kind of dry environments. So. And as I mentioned, all these different environments act to give your microbes a very, very different composition depending on where you are. So if you go from your head to your toe, your microbes change. And you can look at all this really nice infographic. You don't need to worry about the types of bacteria or anything like that. But just to know that depending on where you go in your skin, you have different microbes. But it's important to note that sebaceous areas or moist areas have much more similar microbes than they do to say a dry area. And that's an important thing because in the microbial world, very much like in the macroscopic world, the environment matters, right? The desert has different plants than the rainforest. The same way that your elbow, which would be the desert, has very different microbes than your armpit, which would be the rainforest. So environment matters for these microbes as well. So your sebaceous or oily glands, these are your forehead, behind the ear, your parts of your back, the sides of your nostrils. These have the lowest diversity of microbes. These microbes have to be able to tolerate very, very oily and very, very low nutrient conditions. That's what your sebaceous glands are like. And it's actually dominated by a bacteria called Propionibacteria. And Propionibacteria, in terms of a microbe, it's a really cool microbe. It's the causative agent of acne. So the bacteria that causes acne is Propionibacterium acnes, and it's a really, really common microbe in your sebaceous glands. Now, this microbe is really cool. It's evolved all sorts of fun ways to evade your immune system. So for those of you that have ever suffered from acne, you know it's a really, really difficult problem to get rid of. And it's a really difficult problem to get rid of because Propionibacterium acnes lives naturally on your skin in these sebaceous areas. And it does all sorts of things to trick your body, and which makes it really hard to get rid of. So for those of you that ever suffered from acne, I'm really sorry. It's a really tough thing to deal with, but it's all caused by Propionibacteria acnes and all the crazy and fun things it does to your body. So that's our sebaceous glands. We have moist locations. These are your nose, your armpit, the inguinal crease, the gluteal crease, the sole of your foot, behind the knee, and your inner elbow. These are dominated by bacteria called Staphylococcus and Corneobacterium, and they like environments with high humidity because, as you can imagine, your armpit, especially if you've been exercising, has pretty high humidity. Now, these microbes don't do a lot of cool stuff, but one of the interesting things that they do is they actually they actually give you your smell. So you might not realize it, but you sweat all the time. You know, your wet locations like your armpit and stuff like that, they're perpetually wet. You sweat consistently. Now, this constant sweat that you have gives you sort of your own distinct smell. And what ends up happening is as you sweat, you're releasing all sorts of chemical compounds. And these microorganisms are taking all those chemical compounds inside your sweat, breaking them down, and producing your own unique smell. And so because your microbes are so in tune to you as an individual, I have my own distinct smell, you have your own distinct smell, and everyone has their own distinct smell because we all have different microbes. Again, it's all because your distinct smell without any cologne, perfume, without bathing, all comes from your microorganisms inside your moist locations. So if anyone ever tells you you smell, well, you just tell them, well, it's my microbes. They're making me smell. My BO is because of my microbes. And, you know, that won't work. But, you know, if someone knows this, then you know it works, right? But you get your smell from microbes. And this is not something that's uncommon. Lots of smells in nature have microbial locations. So if you've ever been walking in the woods, that smell of dirt, that's a microbial smell. If you ever have a dog that has like a Dorito chip smell on its foot, that's because of microbes as well. So microbes give lots and lots of smells to the environment. And, you know, you can also think about this in like the context of like cheese. If you like, you know, soft cheeses, they get their smells from microbes as well. So microbes are important for smells sort of around the globe as well. And then finally, we have our dry areas. These are your forearm, your buttock, and lots of parts of your hand and huge parts of your body. Really, really diverse group of microbes. Because it's a very, very tough place to live. Because it's a very tough place to live, there's lots of different microbes that have evolved the capacity to live there as a whole. Not a lot of cool stuff to say, just that they're pretty consistent across people, but they can be very diverse microorganisms. So I don't have a lot to say about the dry areas, but there is a pretty, they don't really do anything cool, just as a note. Every time I do this thing about dry areas of your skin, I can't find any cool stuff that they do, unfortunately. But as I mentioned, there is this interpersonal variability. People have pretty consistent microbiomes, but each person, because of their different environment, has a sort of a variable set of microbes. So we can look at the back here, and the back is dominated by Propionibacteria, but you can also notice there's tons of other bacteria that vary between these four different individuals as well. So you do have variability, and your microbiome is variable. Now, so I mentioned there's a core set of microbes, and that is true. But as I mentioned, you have that variable set of microbiome. And so your microbiome can change on a day-to-day basis. And I really do mean that. I can have a microbiome in my gut one day, and it can slightly vary to the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. But remember, there is a a core set of microbes. So you can see it's sort of from this picture here, right? You have this purple guy, and he remains consistent across all these different things, but you can see all the other colors do vary. So you can have variability on a day-to-day basis, a week-to-week basis, a year-to-year basis, but remember, you do keep a core microbiome unless you do something crazy. So if you are just an average everyday person and then you become strictly a carnivore, or you become a vegan, or you go on a hunger strike, I don't know, you do something crazy to your diet, you can drastically change these things. Antibiotics, like medications, even things like not just antibiotics, but like heart medications can also drastically change your microbiome as well. But your microbiome as a whole is pretty dynamic. There is a core group, but there is a lot of variability in it from, again, day to day, week to week, month to month. And one of the important things we need to think about with microbiomes, and this is true for nature as well, but it's really kind of interesting, in my opinion, to think about it at the microscopic level, and this idea of scales. Now, microbes, remember, the average microbe is only 1 micron long. As a human, we are well over a million times bigger than that, right? So if you scaled up a microbe to be the size of a human would then be scaled up to be the size of the prudential center. That's the difference in size we're talking about here between microbes and humans. So as I mentioned, humans provide many, many ecosystems for those microbes. And so that scale of the human body, right, that 1.8 meters being the average height of a human male, right, that is a big scale for a microbe, not for humans, but for a microbe as well. And the scale of the human body allows your microbe to change on small and large scales. Now, the biggest scale we typically think about is the skin, as we talked about, but your colon and your digestive tract as a whole has pretty big scales, right? It's a 30-foot long tract from mouth all the way to anus. And your microbiome changes as you move from the stomach to the small intestine and down to the colon and eventually to your rectum. And so there's a nice change over this, because what ends up happening is the environment is changing. The stomach is very acidic. There's oxygen present. You move into the small intestine, oxygen is starting to go away, eventually leading to no oxygen inside the colon. And the food, again, digests along the way. So the food that is present here is different than the food that's present here, and it's certainly different than the food that's present as it's getting ready to exit your bum. So scale matters here. And it also matters not at the very large scale, it matters at the very small scale as well. So this is my favorite thing to show in the world. I love this paper. It's from some scientists down at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and they look at microbes on dental plaque. So you might not realize it, but you always have microbes growing on your teeth in the form of plaque, which is what your dentists are trying to get rid of when you go for cleaning. But what we're looking at here is microscope pictures. Each color corresponds to a different species of bacteria. So if we look at this picture here in G, we have a bunch of different species of bacteria, right? Because there's lots and lots of colors. Now, what's cool about this is so the tooth is going to always be sort of like the edge of here, like over here and over here on all these pictures, pretty much, except for these ones on the top, I should say. But what we're looking at here is a very small scale, right? So 10 microns. Right? Very, very small scale. But you're seeing these microbes change on, this picture as a whole is about 50 microns wide. Microbes are changing, the microbes that are living on your dental plaque change on such small scales. And I think that's absolutely remarkable, right? This is such a small scale, right? 50 microns, super duper duper tiny. And your microbes change on that scale. So it doesn't require going from your butt to your mouth for these to change. They change on microscopic scales as well, which I think is absolutely wild. And this is one of the reasons I really like this figure. And again, you can look at how they change on small scales, and it leads to different environmental communities as well present in your mouth, which actually leads to the sort of the formation of cavities and stuff like that. So if you let these communities go long enough, they start to make cavities on your tooth as well. So just as a note, the scale matters at even not just at small scales, but also at very large scales. And your microbiome, as I've mentioned, is an ecosystem. It's living, it's breathing in its own little sense. And the survival of your microbiome is really important to your health, but because of how important it is, the microbes need to be resilient, meaning that if something bad happens, you take an antibiotic, you move to a really cold place, you move to the desert, it doesn't matter what happens. Your microbiome needs to be able to adapt and respond to that new environment. And your microbiome is incredible at doing just that. So no matter where you go, no matter what you do, your microbes can handle whatever you throw at them. And that's an important thing, given how important they are to your health. Now, just put this in perspective. If you change your diet, it will profoundly affect your gut microbiome. And or if you give yourself a very vigorous cleaning, or you go to the dentist and you get a very nice cleaning of your mouth, your microbiome will bounce back. So if I change my diet and then I go back to my original diet, my microbiome will bounce back. If I get a cleaning, my microbiome in my teeth, or a very vigorous cleaning on my hands or something like that, my microbiome will bounce back. Think about COVID, right? If you wash your hands for 20 seconds, you're going to hurt your microbiome really well just to try to get rid of that COVID, right? But your microbiome is resilient. It'll bounce back, which I think is pretty cool. And it's resilient. And so again, it can either be resilient, meaning it resists change, or it can bounce back pretty quick. And some perturbations can actually permanently alter your microbes. So for instance, for those of you who've heard of C. diff, Clostridium difficile, it's a really nasty gut infection. It's a microbe that typically pops up in individuals that go on a very long course of antibiotics. Their microbiome is disturbed for a long period of time by the antibiotics. Clostridium difficile is a jerk. It comes in, it takes over your microbiome, leading to a permanent disruption of your microbiome as a whole. So your microbiome is really resilient, but sometimes other microbes can come in, like Clostridium difficile, and again, for lack of a better word, be a jerk. Now, this directly leads to this idea of probiotics. And I've been doing microbiology education for a long time now. And this is the number one question I always get: do probiotics or prebiotics work? Now, probiotics are simply, you take microbes in some shape or form, whether it's pills or whether it's in one of these gross Tropicana drinks. They're gross. I've tried them. These ones are gross. Pills are fine. Tropicana ones, gross. Then again, that's just my opinion. You might like them. So that's our probiotics. That's in contrast to a prebiotic, which would be like a fermented food or kombucha, which supplies your microorganisms with a specific type of food. That's what we mean by prebiotic versus probiotic. So just as a note. And so there's this huge market. It's a multi-billion-dollar a year market, especially kombucha. Kombucha is exploding in popularity. It's a fermented tea for those of you guys that haven't had it. I think it's gross. Other people love it, but that's just my opinion. But again, this is a huge exploding market, billions and billions of dollars every year. Now, the thing people always ask me is, do probiotics, do prebiotics actually work? Now, the idea behind these work is if you took a probiotic, the idea being it's supposed to seed your gut, your colon, your stomach with healthy microbes. So the idea being is if you're taking these probiotics, they're supposed to get rid of bad bacteria in your stomach with the good bacteria in the probiotics and make you healthier. Now, that's cool in practice. This is what we see in laboratory mice, but that's laboratory mice. When we look at this in humans, we actually don't see the same pattern. When we look at the probiotics, they don't actually seem to establish inside of a human gut. Actually, not in a meaningful way. So if you're taking this gross Tropicana probiotic drink, they don't seem to really colonize. Because as I mentioned, your microbes are your first line of your immune system. They act to get rid of foreign microbes. And microbes that are in probiotics are foreign. So it's really hard for probiotics to colonize your body. So the vast majority of probiotics in a given drink physically just won't colonize. The other issue that we also see with probiotics, well, actually there's two issues, but one of the issues is they simply aren't adapted to you. So as I mentioned, your microbes have evolved with you. They've evolved with you over your whole life. And so the probiotics these microbes that are probiotics in these drinks, they're evolved to someone else. And so they're not in tune to you. So they have a very hard time overcoming your own genetics, your own physiology. And then finally, the other thing we see is once you cut off the source of probiotics, you typically cannot find these probiotics anywhere inside your body. So there's sort of three issues here. You cut the probiotics off, you can't find them anymore. They have a very, very hard time establishing, both because they're not yours and because they simply just have a very hard time colonizing. So what the research tells us at this point in time is that probiotics, like we see in this drink, in the pills, they don't seem to work. And you can believe whatever you want. My sister-in-law subscribes to this idea. She tries it all the time. It doesn't really seem to work for her, and it doesn't work for most people. So that being said, you can do whatever you want with this information, but I just wanted to put that out there. Now, this is direct in contrast to prebiotics. Now, prebiotics such as fermented foods, sauerkraut, kimchi, pickles, kombucha, yogurt, do seem to have an effect. But it's not an effect because you have microbes colonizing. It's an effect because you're giving your microbes good food. And if you want to change your gut microbiome, that's how you do it. You change your diet. You go to a high fiber diet. You change to eating more fermented foods. That's how you change your gut microbiome, not by taking probiotics. Just as a note, if you feel like your stomach's not, you feel like you get cramps all the time, or you get diarrhea all the time, or any of the other terrible things that you could happen to your gut, change your diet first. I wouldn't recommend wasting money on probiotics. Just change your diet. Eat more fiber, eat more grains. Your microbiome will change, and that will likely lead to a much healthier overall microbiome. But again, what we know right now, probiotics don't seem to work at all. Maybe in 10 years, but as of now, the multi-billion-dollar businesses that are built on probiotics, they're essentially selling you snake oil at this point. So that's what we know about probiotics. But your gut microbiome, as we've talked about, is important for your health. It's involved in all sorts of things, including bowel diseases, cancer development. It's directly linked to obesity. So if you take the microbiome from an obese mouse and you transplant it into a sterile mouse, that sterile mouse will then become obese. It's sort of a crazy thing. It's involved in your metabolism, and it's also involved in your physiology and your immune function. So your gut health is really important. And the best thing you can do to make your gut health better is to eat a better diet. Now, in spite of probiotics not working, there is a really effective therapy for treating gut microbiome issues. And this is what we call a fecal transplant therapy. And it is as gross as it sounds. So this has about a 50 to 60% success rate, and it bypasses the stomach. And one of the issues that probiotics don't seem to work all that well is because they can't get through the stomach as well. Now, what fecal transplants are is you take poop from a healthy donor, you process it, you grind it up, you get the microbes out. And again, this is as gross as it sounds. And then you either give the person a liquid or a pill, and they take that liquid or pill to deliver a healthy gut microbiome down here. And that's supposed to improve health. And in fact, it does. So this 50 to 60% success rate is looking at things like irritable bowel syndrome. So about 50 to 60% of people that have irritable bowel syndrome that get fecal transplant therapy actually see an alleviation of their symptoms. The other way they do fecal transplants, and I think is I don't know, it's probably less gross than eating poop directly, but I think this is pretty weird, is sometimes what they'll do is directly bypass the stomach, cut you open, cut your colon open, and insert the feces directly into your colon. So those are the ways. It's a really effective therapy. Again, 50 to 60% success rate is huge, right? If you think about like the success rate of like cancer medications, that's like 10%. This is a huge success rate. Now, this is probably the future of probiotic therapy. But that being said, it's not perfect. There have been several dozen people that have died from this therapy because you can imagine it's dangerous, right? Eating fecal bacteria might not be the safest thing, right? Huge outbreaks of cholera are associated with ingestion of fecal bacteria. So lots of promise, still lots to be known about it. Exactly the same with probiotics. Lots of promise, but we're not quite there yet. And one of the other things that we know about your gut is that it has a direct line to your brain. Now, this is, I think, probably the cooler parts of how microbes affect your physiology, but you have directly connected to your colon, you have a series of nerves. And these nerves form what's called the gut-brain axis. Now, what's cool about the microbes in your colon is they can directly stimulate those nerves to affect your brain chemistry. And when you affect your brain chemistry, you affect your behavior. So let me give you an example. Pretend you eat McDonald's because you're busy with schoolwork and you eat McDonald's every day for a week. Well, your microbes in your stomach, they're going to change your colon are going to change in response to that McDonald's, right? As we talked about. Now, after you stop eating McDonald's, the cool thing is that those microbes in your stomach, they want more McDonald's. They've been eating McDonald's for a week. It's a good food source for them. So they're going to modulate your behavior. So they're going to tickle the nerves in your colon, send signals up to your brain to make you crave McDonald's. And this is not just for McDonald's. This is for any number of foods. You can eat, you could be obsessed with eating, like I've been obsessed with eating pistachios as of late. And I crave pistachios all the time because I've been eating bags and bags of pistachios all throughout the summer. And I crave pistachios. And I'm pretty sure that it's my microbes in my colon. They want more pistachios. So there's tickling my nerves to stimulate me to want pistachios. And there's this crosstalk where your microbes can stimulate your brain, which then in turn can change your physiology, can make your gut less likely to absorb certain nutrients, which will then change your microbe to want more of the same thing it's trying to change. So there's this really fascinating crosstalk on this gut-brain axis as a whole. And again, I think this is absolutely crazy because your microbes can influence your behavior. And now they can influence your behavior this way, but they can also directly influence your behavior through more conventional means. So there's all sorts of studies that link changes in your gut microbiome to neurodegenerative diseases like dementia and Alzheimer's. So they can directly affect your brain in that way. There's also been linkages between your gut microbiome and depression as well. So there's all sorts of, and the other one I should probably mention is there does seem to be direct linkages between your gut microbiome and autism as well. So there's all sorts of ways your gut microbes can talk to your brain, influence your physiology, influence your behavior, influence your actions. And I think that is absolutely remarkable. And it shows how important they are with just your average everyday functioning. And I also mentioned that these are important for obesity. And part of the reason their microbes are in your gut are important for obesity is because they will stimulate that nerve to make you hungrier over an extended period of time. So make you eat more, make you become more obese so that you can feed them this whole. So that's your gut. Skin health is also heavily influenced by microbes. So there's many skin conditions such as eczema, which my wife will tell you is not a very fun skin condition to have. They're associated with bad microbiomes. So we know that those that have eczema have an altered microbiome relative to healthy individuals. Now, the idea being here is you have a sort of a deviation of your skin microbiome from what it's supposed to be. And because it's deviating from what it's supposed to be with people that have eczema, your body's having an inflammatory response to it. And that inflammatory response gives you, if you have eczema, those bumps, those itchinesses, right? And that's all due to just the presence of the wrong microbes. So I think that's a sort of important thing. Lots of new information to be learned here about eczema and all sorts of skin conditions with bad microbes, but there does seem to be an overall linkage here between your skin health and microbes. And as I mentioned, it has a direct linkage between your skin as well as sort of the overall health of your skin in terms of pathogens as well. And sort of getting ready to end this lecture, there's sort of this interesting link between partners and microbiomes. So as you spend more time with anyone, whether it's a friend, more similar than you would expect just by chance. So as you interact with people, your microbiome becomes more and more similar. So my wife and I have been married for about 5 years. Our microbiomes are probably very, very similar. Your pets also do the same, and your pets don't have to give you kisses or not to make you resemble them. So as you're exposed to pets, your microbiome becomes more diverse. So there's lots of evidence that show that children that grow up in houses with pets, in particular dogs, because dogs are getting dirty, whereas cats are just kind of doing cat things. The kids that grow up in houses with dogs are less likely to get autoimmune diseases or microbiome associated diseases. So your pets themselves can modify their behavior. Can modify your own microbiome, which, as we talked about, can directly impact your behavior and your health. And this is my dog, Snickers. She likes to be cuddled like a baby. But again, overall, your microbes are good for you. When we talked about microbes in nature, and we talked about how they are important for the earth, we talked about them in a good fashion, and that is true for your gut, your microbiome as well. It involved with your health, how much you weigh, your behavior, and how much nutrients you get. They're involved directly with every aspect of your body. They are their own little organ in addition to all the major organ systems that you have, and they can have some pretty dramatic effects on your body's physiology. Now, as sort of as a last note before we end the class for the day, everything has a microbiome. There is no place on this planet, as I mentioned, that are sterile. Every animal, your dog, your cat, your ferret, a hamster, everything has a microbiome. So nothing is sterile, but some animals that we know actually don't have a defined microbiome. It's simply just random. So we know there are moths out there that have just, they don't have a core microbiome like we do. It's not really important for their overall health, but they just get it from nature because it just naturally colonizes them. But for the vast majority of critters on this planet, microbiomes are important. They are directly involved within all aspects of their physiology, very much like we are. Remember, microbes have been around since the beginning. They have a very long evolved relationship with not just one another, but also with the animals and plants and everything else that's on this planet. And so everything is directly tied to microbes one way or another, whether it's the food you eat, whether it's how you digest your food, or whether it's how it affects the physiology of your favorite dog, or just your dog, I should say. And there's lots of startup companies, and there's lots of people that are trying to use the microbiome to solve problems. If you want to take a peek at that, I've linked to a nice little YouTube video down here that sort of goes into that as well. But with that, that's going to be the end of our little talk about the microbiome, and that will be the end of our class, which goes by always faster than you would imagine. At least for me, it does. We went through 25 classes, or 26 classes, 24 classes with one another, and that didn't take very long. So I hope you guys all learned something from this class. I hope that this was a very enjoyable experience for you. I always enjoy teaching these things because I get to talk about all sorts of cool stuff. But if you ever have any questions about not just your, the stuff for this class, but if you have any science questions in general, like you hear something and you don't quite know what it is, feel free to reach out. I'm always looking to talk about science as well. And just as a final note, if you well, actually, two final notes. First, please make sure you fill out your course evaluations. As I've mentioned a couple of times now, I really take those to heart, and I try to improve my course to make it better for the next group of kids and adults I teach. And then finally, if you have, please make sure you check on your grades. Let me know before next week if there's anything that doesn't look like it makes sense or anything like that. So with that, I won't see you guys again, but I will see you virtually through your grade book. So I hope you guys have a great rest of your summer, and you stay safe and take care.